Well, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensies. This is a podcast where we explore thoughts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today I have another awesome guest with me, Dr. Michael Peterson. He is professor of philosophy at Asbury Theological Seminary. His books include Science, Evolution, and Religion, God and Evil, and With All Your Mind, including this wonderful new book, C.S. Lewis and the Christian Worldview, which is out 2020 this year. And then he also has a forthcoming book from Cambridge called Religion and the Biosciences. So without further ado here, Dr. Peterson, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
You're welcome. Good to be here.
Yeah. So where do I even want to start? We just had such a great conversation off air about faith and philosophy. So can we just rehash that a little bit? So we were talking about some of the greats. We were talking about Keith Andel. We were talking about Art Holmes and how you were part of this original movement, which broadened the scope of philosophy and kind of made way for the next generation and the next generation of Christian philosophers.
That's true.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about faith and philosophy really quickly?
Yeah, faith and philosophy is really the publishing wing of the Society of Christian Philosophers, which was founded in 1978 at the APA. A number of us Christian philosophers had found each other, made some connections during the 70s, particularly the late 1970s, and decided that we'd have a sort of an organizational meeting in conjunction with the APA, which meets annually. Mm-hmm. And we would send out some kind of a circular that if anybody else wanted to come and talk about interest in both being a philosopher and being a Christian, just ecumenically conceived, mm-hmm. no denominational or sectarian restrictions.
Yeah.
And honestly, the handful of us that found each other and would often circulate by snail mail our correspondence back in the 70s couldn't have been more than a dozen and a half people.
Yeah.
But when we put this notice out, it got in the APA bulletin, of course, like all the other groups do when they publish the APA bulletin for a conference. And we were overwhelmed by the turnout. And it was a double door on the room. We had to open that and let people just do standing room only and overflow into the hallway. Wow. of the Netherland Hilton Hotel in Cincinnati that year. And we let Bill Alston, the great William Alston, arguably one of the best philosophers of language in the world at the mm-hmm. time, give his testimony about his return to faith while on sabbatical at Oxford. Mm-hmm. And he did that, and it was very moving. And we decided at that time to go ahead and declare that we were going to start a new society, the Society of Christian Philosophers, and elect Bill first president.
Wow.
Very momentous occasion.
Yeah. Well, that's huge in so many different ways because, now we have this resurgence of Christian philosophers, Christian philosophy of religion, but then it's even spread it out to this new topic called analytic theology,
right?
Which is, like the grandchildren of that movement. And my professor is a professor of analytic theology, and I've benefited from that, which is fantastic.
It's true. I mean, when I did my texts, I saw this coming, this wave coming. I said to my Oxford editor, the surfer does not create the wave, the surfer times it. And I know nothing about surfing. It just sounded good to say.
I think that's right, yeah.
But as long as you're buying this, that's great. So I said to her, this wave is coming. There are no texts. There's been burnout in philosophy of religion, except for the Catholic colleges and universities mm-hmm. that didn't succumb to positivism and a lot of the other movements that really hurt a robust, sort of realist type philosophy of religion.
Yeah.
The theology really is about something real, and that you can make statements about theological realities that are actually true or false. Mm-hmm. So that was all kind of burned out. No good textbooks, no up-to-date textbooks. And so when I did my textbook, in the early 90s, Reason and Religious Belief, for the first time ever, I included philosophical analysis of Christian doctrines.
Yeah.
And within several years, I quit doing that because it had spun off the rebirth of philosophical theology.
Mhm.
That's more philosophical theology, technically, than just philosophy of religion, because it's looking at an analytic way at specifically Christian doctrines.
Right.
Incarnation, prayer, miracle, whatever. So we revived philosophical theology and then began to realize we're bringing analytic tools
Yeah.
to this task. And so in recent years, it's just been labeled analytic theology.
Yep.
Great stuff.
Yeah. I've been really blessed by it, and yeah, it's been fantastic. But for you, you're not you weren't trained specifically as a philosopher of religion. You're trained as a philosopher of science.
That's true.
So how did you get into well, first, actually, I'm really interested. What'd you do your dissertation on?
Concept of causality in 20th century philosophy of science.
Wow. Okay. That's it's quite a big one.
It's related to the concept of scientific law.
Yep.
Laws pick out causes and formulate causes, and it's related to the idea of scientific explanation.
Mm-hmm.
But largely pushing off, analyzing, evaluating, and pushing off of the prevailing Humean concepts of causality that were in the positivist movement, which was born out of philosophy of science.
Yep.
And then kind of spilled over onto everything else, including religious language.
That's right.
You know,
metaphysics was supposed to be bunk after that.
It's right. So at any rate, I did that, and my dissertation advisor, Edward Madden, had a book, a realist philosophy of science book called Causal Powers, and I largely did it in that area. But Ed was also in print as being a big atheist. And in the 60s, again, that's really kind of a dry spell in philosophy of religion.
Right.
But philosophy of the problem of evil was talked about to some extent, not in the very robust way it is now, but John Hick, the great John Hick, had a book, Evil and the God of Love.
Yep.
66 was the publication date. Very magisterial work in many ways. And that's for the side of theism and Christianity. And Ed Madden had a book published in 68, Evil and the Concept of God, where he's kind of the voice of the critic, the voice of the atheist against the theist and Christian. And interestingly, early in that book, he says the logical problem, we hadn't used the labels at that time, logical problem and evidential problem of evil, which were kind of my labels actually early in this literature.
Wow.
Because of Ed, because he said early on, the logical problem is not nearly as formidable as people think. He's an atheist.
Yeah.
But he says it's really more of a business of the evidence of evil brought against Christian and theistic beliefs. So the idea of an evidential argument was born in his book.
Wow.
1968, didn't catch on. It just didn't catch on. So the planning as rebuttal of the logical argument had to catch on and solidify for several more years until Bill Rowe published his work on the problem of evil in the late 70s, over a decade later after Ed had already written this. And he comes out with his version of an evidential argument, and it gets uptake.
Yeah.
And
so
Rowe we look at.
Well, I did not know that language came from there. I kind of have the idealized version from, planning a kind of put to death Mackey's logical problem of evil. Yeah. And then William Rowe comes along and he talks about is it Rowe or Mackey who talks about the deer in the woods with the burning log?
Bill Rowe, the case of Bambi, it came to be called. The
case of Bambi, yeah. Bambi. Yeah. And that has to do with like gratuitous evil and the amount of evil, and the conversation on evil has changed because of this language, because of planning on, and because what you're saying, it comes back all the way to your advisor then.
Yeah, gratuitous evil is Ed's word. And if people ever wondered, why do we get that word into the current literature? It's from Ed through me.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. That's so amazing. I'm writing my master's thesis, and I'm looking at the authorial analogy, and I'm pulling a little bit from C.S. Lewis, a little bit from Kevin Van Hooser, but I'm talking about the problem of gratuitous evil, and then the problem of the amount of evil. So it's amazing to see it all come back in this conversation.
Yep.
Yeah. So we could talk about so much of that, and hopefully maybe someday we can. But I had you on because I want to talk about C.S. Lewis and the Christian worldview.
Yeah.
And this is another book that I'm reading for Dr. Van Hooser. I'm doing a reading class on Cornelius Van Til and C.S. Lewis. And so I saw this book come out, and any book on C.S. Lewis as thinker, philosopher, I will buy. Just, I don't care who writes it, I will buy it. But I was so encouraged to see that it said in the Christian worldview, especially since I'm putting Lewis in conversation with Van Til, who really focused on worldviews, the Christian worldview. So in your, just right off the bat, how'd you get into C.S. Lewis?
I think I got into Lewis by buying Mere Christianity and Miracles, probably in the very late 60s or very early 70s as an undergrad.
Wow.
Philosophy major, and just loved it. And I knew that it was not technical philosophy, but had very good philosophical instincts.
Yeah.
And, back at I was a fairly new Christian as an undergrad, converted at age 16, and by my wife's family.
Wow.
And ended up getting married out of that as well. So
it's a good deal.
Pretty good deal. And so I was thinking about what my future calling and career would be like, and something along the lines maybe of the intellectual presentation of Christian faith. I've always been kind of an academic-oriented person, and I saw that modeled in a certain way in Lewis.
Yeah. That's so interesting to me because for me, coming downstream of guys like you and Planning and all these folks, it seems like, yeah, of course, I've seen you guys do it, and so I have something to look to. But what would make you said you were kind of an academic, but what would drive you to want to be a philosopher in that era where it wasn't okay for Christians to be philosophers, or wasn't looked at as like an okay thing?
That's a really good question. I just loved it. I mean, if you think about it, you got to take your skills, your passions, your opportunities, and find, in a sense, where they intersect to find your contribution and calling.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, newly converted, pretty academic, I saw in the religious community just enough anti-intellectualism or a little distancing from intellectual things that I didn't think was healthy. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty young and naive at that point in my life, but I still felt that way and felt that it could use all the help it could get on the intellectual side.
Yeah,
I saw from Lewis, among others, that it really had intellectual content, and the intellectual content is potent.
Yeah.
And in a sense, that's one thing I wanted to express in the book on Lewis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so helpful. And that brings us right to our next point. So you said Mere Christianity is not a work of philosophy, but it's got philosophical teeth. You could tell that Lewis had been thinking philosophically. So was C.S. Lewis a philosopher? Would you categorize him as a philosopher?
I would, and as not a professional philosopher, but there's a deeper truth about every person being their own philosopher, holding beliefs about very important and unavoidable philosophical issues like what is the meaning of life?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be a human being? What are the grounds of my moral obligations? These are philosophical issues that even the uneducated or unphilosophically tutored people think about just to be human.
Yeah.
And so he's definitely a philosopher in that sense. But also, of course, you may or may not know that he took 3 honors degrees at Oxford.
Yeah.
Classics, literature, and philosophy, and tried his early wings teaching philosophy at the university level, but eventually got a job doing literature.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I think maybe Barkman's book recounted that um, that he was a tutor for F.H. Bradley's like grandson or something like that when he
Yeah,
worked as a tutor. So
Karen.
he did do some work in philosophy there at Oxford, which after his own degree in that, which is so interesting to me.
That's true. And philosophy at that time, he'll admit, was very difficult, linguistic philosophy. And he tangled with several who were kind of linguistic philosophers. And he gives it sort of a mixed evaluation of his own performance. But he always has instincts to go to what's most at stake, most important, and not be sort of befuddled by the technicalities.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think the people he was interacting with at the time were shaped by like the early Wittgenstein, right? And so,
Uh,
uh, is that right?
both the earlier and the later.
Oh, okay, okay.
For
I didn't know
example,
ordinary language was around at that point. Yeah.
yeah, because the Yanscombe legend, where
Yep.
Jenny Yanscombe was at the Socratic Club when he
Hmm.
read the third chapter of Miracles and has the very famous legendary encounter.
Yeah.
She's speaking on behalf of ordinary language philosophy.
Okay, that makes sense. I should have looked at that more. Yeah, so there's that whole, and for those who are not familiar, Elizabeth Anscombe was a very good philosopher, and she had studied under Wittgenstein and has translated some of his works. And they had
Correct.
the Socratic Club where they're debating philosophy, and there's this huge legend that she just wiped the floor with C.S. Lewis's third chapter of Miracles, and then he decided to move into stories, children's fairy stories instead of doing
True.
direct apologetics now. And so a couple guys have come along, Victor Reppert, Jerry Root, he goes at that pretty hard. What do you think about that whole myth and Lewis, his performance against Anscombe?
I do think that the sort of the extremely negative interpretation is just wrong,
Mhm.
incorrect to the facts,
Yeah.
and may come from people who'd like it to be true. But Lewis, he changed the title of the chapter in the next edition
Yeah. From
because of that
self-contradiction.
encounter. Well, the first chapter, because he's the sworn opponent, talk about worldview encounter.
There we
As
go.
a theist, he's a sworn opponent of naturalism.
Hmm.
And not that there aren't other worldviews on
Right.
the cafeteria line of worldviews, but in secular, Western, modern culture,
Hmm.
naturalism really is the default worldview of atheism.
Yeah.
Because atheism is really not a full-orbed worldview. It's entailment of naturalism.
Yeah.
But if it's going to make any positive statements other than we're not a theist, then it has to have the framework of other naturalist, assumptions.
Yeah.
And so Lewis was certainly an opponent of that, and that is his target, among other goals to accomplish in Miracles.
Yeah.
In the Miracles book, chapter 3 is his attempt to show that there's something deeply wrong with naturalism that will not allow to account for the validity of human reason.
Yeah.
He titles it the self-contradiction of naturalism, which is technically inaccurate.
Hmm.
She showed that, Anscombe showed that, and also helped clarify some verbal distinctions, like the distinction between reasons and causes.
Yeah. Yeah. I found that actually very helpful in my own work, in my own thought. And then also, something I think she talked about was non-rational causes instead of everything either being irrational or not.
And he cleaned that up
Yeah.
when he rewrote the chapter. He cleaned that up and he retitled it. He knew there was still something deeply wrong
Hmm.
with a naturalist worldview in relation to all we know about human reason.
Yeah.
And so he just entitles the next edition, chapter 3, "The Cardinal Difficulty
Yeah.
of the Naturalist."
Yeah. I had to go on eBay and find one of his, I think it's 1941 when he published it. I had to find one of the originals to even find that original chapter because all
Yeah,
the ones you get today are all revised.
it's true.
Yeah. So, okay. So going back to this book, there's been a lot written on C.S. Lewis as philosopher, as thinker. So how does your book, C.S. Lewis and the Christian Worldview, how does that differ from other books by like Barkman, McGrath, Baggett, Kreeft? So what made you want to write this book now? And then how does it differ from the other ones already published?
For several decades, at least 2 decades, I've been convinced that this book had to exist. I just recently got around to writing it, finishing it. For one thing, the literature on Lewis predominantly is about his biography or his literature. All good stuff. And these have created whole cottage industries. People are so fascinated by Lewis's biography and his literature. The few things that are out there about his philosophy are generally pretty good, I think.
Yeah.
But they usually pick up on one argument or one concept. All great, except they never, in my view, addressed in a thorough, comprehensive, systematic way his understanding that the deepest level of engagement is worldview engagement.
Yes.
And that Christianity needs to be seen in with other dimensions, of course. Its recommendations for living life and for spiritual connection with God. But at one level, Christianity offers a worldview that is intellectually competitive with the other worldviews on offer in our culture. And to pose it like that, I thought, and do it in a comprehensive way, not just in a little article or a talk, but make the whole book that way. And so really, I did the table of contents as a kind of a skeletal outline of his worldview. I'm a big framework person, and that suggests the framework. Not that I don't appreciate the other books that were about Lewis's philosophy. Barkman's is very long and very scholarly. And McGrath has done a very good biography and some other things like that. Baggett's book, C.S. Lewis as Philosopher, is got just a generous handful of really good essays. But it's not a book that drives one central argument all the way through. Things like that. I thought, well, nobody's really doing what I think ought to be done with Lewis.
That's why I was so excited to see and the Christian Worldview, because I've had that same inclination that he's presenting a view of life. You see it in his essay. I think it's in Is Theology Poetry at the end, where he talks about that famous quote, right? So I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun is risen, not only because I see it, but by it I see everything.
Yes.
And to me, that's worldview thinking. He's saying this makes sense of the world.
And he also has a quote in which he says, a lot of people think that we're recommending Christianity because we believe it's good. It'll improve society. But we also need to make sure we tell them it's because it's true.
I love that. And it's beautiful. You could add that in there too as well. Okay. So in order to understand Lewis's worldview, we'd have to actually go through your whole book, and we don't have time for that. And people just go buy the book. He like he said, he laid out the skeletal view of C.S. Lewis's worldview, but it's even more. It's more than a skeleton because he put some flesh on it as well. But a couple things I wanted to focus on for our conversation here is just a couple of his arguments, which they get hashed out a lot, but they're so good. There's a reason they do. And then maybe the doctrine of the Trinity, and we'll see if we can get into good and evil as well. Each one of these could be their own podcast episode. So for the listeners, we're going to have to be a little bit more brief than maybe you'd want, but we'll see if we can get it done here. So I wanted to start with the argument from desire. Can you sketch that out for us?
I think interpreters differ a little bit over exactly what that is. It's different aspects, sometimes called the argument from joy. But at any rate, the fact that Lewis makes this such a central element of his life story, and the whole Surprised by Joy book, which is one of his attempts at an autobiography, then he gives that allegorical autobiography in Pilgrim's Regress. There's also an unpublished manuscript that has recently been discovered. It's just been titled Early Prose Joy. And in that, we actually learned some details he'd misremembered, interestingly enough. McGrath brings some of those corrections out in his book.
Yeah, the date of his conversion and stuff like that.
It's funny how Lewis missed some of those own details of his own life, but
Yeah.
at any rate, the whole idea that joy, the search for joy, the desire for deep meaning and fulfillment in life was such an element in Lewis's own journey. And at one level, you'd say, well, here's the unique personality of Lewis. He loved romantic literature, by the romantic authors and poets, and he loved, in many ways, a lot of atmospheric novels and things. He said he loved Squirrel Nutkin and the suggestions of the season, the fall season coming. And I have to admit, I have no such emotional responses to these things.
Yeah. I've heard
So
that a lot.
when you think about this, you think, well, then we must not mistakenly identify Lewis's idiosyncratic emotional makeup with a universal human desire for joy and fulfillment.
Yeah.
And so I see him with his own idiosyncratic makeup, just like we all have our own, basically being in the Augustinian tradition of the restless heart.
Yeah, totally.
Thou madest for thyself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. And so that's the way I look at Lewis, in a way that's universalizable to all of us. And the debate often about this is whether joy is an argument in Lewis or just a motivating drive.
Right.
And some people make a dichotomy here. It's just a motivating drive. There's no way to make an argument from joy. I don't see it that way. And in the book, I try to talk about a worldview context to make sense of all important phenomena of life in the world: mind, morality, the desire for fulfillment and joy.
Yeah.
And so good and evil, lots of important phenomena that require worldview explanation. So my point would be, it's an argument in the sense that that drive makes sense and is not irrational in a theistic universe, distinctively Christian universe, but is irrational and odd on the face of a universe described by naturalism or other alternatives. I mean, that makes the argument.
I love that argument. And I love the way you pose that as well, because that is that starting premise is something that we all experience. We're all experiencing that. And then you're asking them, hey, look, given this phenomena, which one makes sense of that experience that we all are feeling? And if you don't feel that experience, okay, well, we'll use a different argument, but I think you do, if you're being honest with yourself. And so it's a worldview argument. It's a way of comparing and contrasting worldviews, trying to make sense of the phenomena that we're all experiencing.
Yep, I think that's right.
Yeah, it's so fantastic. It gets me all, I'm starting to sweat. I'm getting excited here.
Now, there are different ways of viewing what a worldview argument can be, by the way. For example, you could have a sort of presuppositional apologetics, which I don't engage in.
Right.
Saying, these are my presuppositions, and from them I'm going to deduce all the conclusions that I'm driving toward. But I think this kind of worldview argument is more, let's look at the explanatory framework that does the best job.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, so would you consider yourself in the cumulative case, inference to the best explanation kind of apologetic camp? Yeah.
If you had to put a label on it, I think I would.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. And so I consider myself more in the presuppositional, but it seems like we're doing very similar things where we're starting with this phenomena and we're saying, which worldview best makes sense of that phenomena that we're experiencing. Yeah. I love that. Okay. So we got our desire. Would you put, I know you'd mentioned it in your book, sometimes it's called the lived ontological proof.
Yeah.
Is that synonymous with this desire, or is that something else?
Yes. I take Lewis there when he says, my search for joy was a kind of a lived ontological proof or argument. I'm not sure exactly what term he uses. Well, you just think about this.
Mhm.
The classical Anselmian ontological argument is about the concept of the most perfect possible being,
Yep.
a being than which there can be no greater.
Mm-hmm.
And from that, Anselm moves to the conclusion that that being must exist. We know about planning his rehabilitation and his modal upgrade of that argument, all that stuff. Okay.
Yep.
So when Lewis says that, first of all, it's an allusion to his classical philosophical background education, that's for sure. What a connection to make, but it's a lived argument. So the concept of God for Anselm, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And Anselm says, well, you have a concept of God, and from that I can prove that God exists. So if you're thinking of a God that doesn't exist, that's not the greatest possible being. All that stuff, that line of logic.
Yeah.
Now, in Lewis's life, he had almost a 20-year-long search for God, starting from early atheism in his teens, because he kind of lost his faith when his mother died when he was very young, didn't find an anchor or foundation, and early on was a materialist type thinker, went through various stages of philosophy, idealism, even a little bit of dualism, on and on, finally to theism, and ultimately to Christianity. Okay. Now, in a sense, he was looking for a concept of an ultimate that he could live his life by.
Yep.
And he keeps saying at every philosophical stage, it wasn't satisfying, I couldn't live by it, and I found some kind of conceptual problem with it. So both conceptual and practical problems. And he also refers to King Arthur's court, the perilous seat, the siege perilous, where any knight who sits in that seat who's unworthy would be killed. And this Arthurian legend, so in other words, you can't put something in the seat of your heart and the throne of your life that's unworthy.
Yeah.
And he had 20 years of doing that. So this is a kind of lived ontological argument of trying, how about this concept? How about this concept? And none of them were satisfying. None of them were able to be lived by and give a satisfying life. And plus he started finding problems philosophically with materialism, naturalism, dualism, all of which he tried over a 20-year period. So the lived ontological, in my view, is looking for the concept of a being that really is worthy of worship and you really can trust your life to.
Yeah. That's a great way of explaining it. It reminds me a little bit of his first and second things. You aim for the first things, you get second. But if you try to put one of those second things on the throne, you're not going to get either. Yeah, that's helpful. So I picked these three arguments that I want to go through. We have the argument from desire, which I think kind of corresponds to the affections. Then you have the argument of reason, which corresponds to reason and rationality. And then the argument from morality, which corresponds to how you should act. And I think those three hit on like three central aspects of what it means to be human. And I love that Lewis made arguments from them. So moving on to the argument from reason, I love this. I spent a lot of time reading this. I love Victor Repper. I love any kind of all of these guys. There's been so much work done on it. But what I found so interesting from your book was a quote from A Grief Observed. I wanted to just read that because I thought it was an interesting way of looking at the argument from reason. And Lewis wrote this under a pseudonym, so people didn't know it was Lewis until, was it T.S. Eliot discovered it, that Lewis wrote this?
Well, I'm not remembering exactly who, but I think he wrote it, the pseudonym was N.W. Clerk.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and so everything Lewis does has some kind of meaning behind it.
Yeah.
And I forgot what it stood for, but it means like something about a writer. Clerk's a writer.
One who can read and write.
Yeah, that's right.
I take that as a person who's numb and has lost the richness of life by the loss of an intimate partner. And he can just read and write, and he's decided to write out his grief in like a journal.
Yeah. Wow, that's so deep. So in this quote, he says, if H, and he's talking about Joy, his wife who just passed, is if she's just gone, if she is not any longer, if she didn't go to heaven, she didn't have an immaterial soul, if she is not, then she never was. Then I mistook a cloud of atoms for a person. There aren't and there never were any people. Death only reveals the vacuity that was always there. And so it's like another take, even in his grief, another take on the argument from reason that if she was just matter in motion, then I mistook her for a person. I thought she's just atoms, and then I'm just atoms, and then everyone's just atoms. But that can't be, because atoms can't be deceived about other atoms being persons. It was just like, even in his grief observed, that's amazing.
I know in some ways it's an intellectually complicated book, a book just emoting. One would think it's not really just emoting, because it's got these intellectual points that he discusses. But I do think, for one who experiences tragic loss, as he did with losing joy to cancer, your emotions are all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
You can be angry with God. You can question your faith. There are a lot, particularly early in the experience of grieving, and this is a grief observed. So you see in the early pages, he's all over the place.
Yeah.
He imagines that God was a vivisectionist, a mad experimental scientist who cut Joy up in the laboratory and made her suffer so. And then he also questions whether maybe materialism, which he'd long since vanquished philosophically, that rears its head here in the passage that you're quoting and kind of haunts him. And if materialism was true, that means this was all a big mistake. I thought I was a person relating to another person.
Yeah.
And so the philosophical dimension of this doesn't go away even in his grief. And like Nick Wolterstorff's book, Lament for a Son, which again is recording your grief and the process of coming to grips with your faith and your loss. I would hand Nick's book to a person who's going through grief. I don't know if I would hand Lewis's book. All the philosophical points come up like that.
Yeah. Yeah. What an interesting point there. Yeah. So C.S. Lewis's Miracles is where his argument, what's come to be known as the argument from reason, is best laid out. Though you can find it as a through line through all of his essays, in a lot of his essays. And De Futilitate was probably the best essay where it's explicated. But can you sketch out just the argument from reason for us? I know it's very complex and it's been taken in different ways.
Well, the whole idea of actually it goes to the reason and causes distinction that I mentioned earlier that Anscombe helped him understand.
Mm-hmm.
If his basic point is that if what we call human thought is basically a product of non-rational material causes, then it's not rational.
Yeah.
And he does say in the book he's aware of the sort of classical naturalism and classical materialism viewpoint that determinism is entailed by naturalism or materialism. That has given way in more recent decades to the possibility that, and often the eternality of the cosmos, of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
Even Einstein couldn't easily come to grips with the implication of his own theory that there was a Big Bang.
Yeah.
The universe had a beginning. And from Aristotle on, that's been a feeling that the universe is all there is, of the physical, and it's deterministic in its operations. So that would be bad for rational thought if rational thought were a product of that. But, Lewis also makes room in Miracles to discuss even what he knew of indeterminism at the time, because quantum mechanics was being born. So he even comments on that a little bit. But I think most people fixate on the deterministic part. But regardless of determinism or indeterminism, as long as those are non-rational material forces, they undercut rationality. That's his point.
Yeah.
And what it is about rationality that's so key to protect is really at least twofold. It's not just any old thought because, I could eat a pizza this evening and go to bed and it caused me to dream and have images that aren't veridical. And so that's just life. That's just being a physical creature. But it's when we want to make an argument,
Yeah.
And have a line of reasoning, point by point, inferential reasoning, linear reasoning, discursive reasoning. That's in great jeopardy. That's undone and cannot be valid if natural forces really account for it. Most people fixate on that when they talk about Lewis's argument from reason, but you can't just have that. As Aristotle told us, if nothing is self-evident, nothing can be proved. So another rational capacity of reason is seeing self-evident truths, things that are immediately true.
Yeah.
And of course, we know that the later few decades now of epistemology have really gotten into kind of a revival of Thomas Reid.
Yeah.
And realist epistemology that knows we have native intellectual powers that will deliver immediately and directly to us some things that are true, given the right circumstances, right environment, all of that. So the power, and that would be undercut. Reason understood that way of delivering immediate beliefs that are rationally warranted would also be undercut if natural forces ultimately account for them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that so much. And initially I thought, this is the same as Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, and then reading some more, reading Plantinga more, reading Reppert more, seeing that these are actually two different arguments where Plantinga is arguing that if naturalistic evolution were the cause for your cognitive faculties, then you couldn't even believe that to be true because it would probably give you beliefs that are aimed at survival instead of necessarily aimed at truth. Whereas Lewis is saying, look, you're trying to argue with me and you're trying to get me to see reason, but your whole underlying worldview says that everything you think and believe is the cause of physical happenings in your skull, and physical happenings don't respond to the laws of logic. Like, your whole argument presupposes or showing that what you're saying is self-defeating. We're just matter in motion. There's no way we're all causes, and there's no reason. But Lewis always has this line where he slips in where he says that's like philosophically slitting your own throat.
Yeah, and Plantinga does give him credit for inspiring the evolutionary argument against naturalism. So they are very related, but the natural force that Plantinga identifies is more updated to be, biological evolution,
right,
and natural selection.
Yeah, that's really great. I love that. I can't talk about it now. Maybe we can talk later. I love that idea. In my paper, I want to blend some Lewis and Van Til with actually Donald Davidson, because I think that there's a line through there that we can talk about. But moving on to the argument for morality, a lot of people will know this one, so we don't have to go in depth a ton. But something interesting that I wanted to talk about with you is there's some people online who think that, and that's a bad sentence to start with. There's some people online, but who think, Lewis is a heretic. He talks about this Tao, and so he's holding to like Eastern religion. And can you explain for us what Lewis meant by the Tao and how this interacts with his argument for morality?
He actually says in a footnote or someplace in The Abolition of Man, and he also says elsewhere that he was thinking about using the word logos.
Yeah.
But he didn't, because that seemed to have the obvious baggage of coming from the Christian tradition and all that. So he was basically trying to, and he wanted to suggest that there's something that's not distinctively Christian about our common morality, which is construed in a realist way. It's objective and it's universal throughout the human race. Yeah. And that, he says, is so important to being human, but it's also important as one pointer to God. And that's his moral argument. Mere Christianity starts with a realist version, natural law version of the moral argument, unlike a Kantian version of the moral argument.
Yeah.
And some other types of moral arguments. His is really sort of a popularized version. He's a realist. He's a moral realist, obviously, and he thinks there's a natural law. This is Thomistic language.
Mm-hmm.
He almost never gives Thomas the credit he should. Everybody is always connecting him with Plato.
Yeah,
that's true in many respects, not in all.
Mm-hmm.
But he's Aristotelian down deep and very often Thomistic, and that's what this is, as opposed to a Platonic argument. Aristotle and Thomas would be very proud of him. So what he thought was maybe his best book, just a tight, well-reasoned book, was Abolition.
Yeah.
And he's just arguing from the presence of a common moral law, knowable by all sort of normal human beings. And he doesn't even make much of a case for God, really, in Abolition.
Mm-hmm.
But that same moral law spoken of in Abolition, key to our humanity, is what he picks up the thread on, first page of Mere Christianity, and makes it an argument for theism.
Yeah. Well, and that fits your worldview model again, or his worldview model, if that's really what he was going with, because someone might, or one of our listeners, some of our listeners might hear there's something not distinctively Christian, and they might kind of pull back from that. But if you think about it, it's important that it's not distinctively idiosyncratic to our religion, because we want this common phenomena that, hey, look, you know how you think it's wrong for someone to steal a bit of your orange, as C.S. Lewis says, or to steal your seat on the bus, or to take your wallet? Yeah, I think that's wrong too. And that makes sense over here in this Christian worldview, what Lewis is doing in Mere Christianity. But it's not going to make sense over in your worldview.
But see, that's the doctrine of creation in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
Long before you get to discussing the doctrine of redemption or something like that, what kind of thing are we as created by God in God's image? We're rational, moral, social, relational beings, and the moral aspect of our nature, common to us all, is going to have common moral insights. At the end of Abolition, he has an appendix. Mm-hmm. It shows that Chinese culture, Indian culture, cultures past and present, all share the same basic fundamental ideas about the value of life, the value of property, truth-telling and lying, all those, but they package them differently at their place in history or their particular culture or religion. But there's something going on. It's not just cultural and religious relativism. People get fixated on the little minor differences in articulation and forget the fact that they're all sort of centering on the same human values.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've heard both ways from people wanting to deny the moral argument. Some say, like you said, they try to downplay the similarities. Others will go, yeah, look, it's just the same similarities. Maybe there's an archetype at play, but there's nothing transcendent about it. And we want to say, well, no, it's so inescapable that every culture has felt this way, or most cultures have felt this way. Yeah. And what's the reason for that? Which view of the world can make sense of that?
That's right. That's what I think. That's right.
Yep. Okay.
In many ways, he's a moral realist. He's he's a theological realist. He believes these are about real things, and that doesn't make sense in a lot of worldviews.
Right. Yeah, and one of it, man, he's so good. But something he does so well with that is he, in Mere Christianity, he talks about how you can deny that until you bump into somebody, and then it becomes very real. Then everyone becomes a moral realist. Hey, you should not have done that. You ought not to have done or treated me like that.
Yeah. And it's okay if society conditions us to think these ways. It's okay if there's some evolutionary explanation. My point in the book is simply that these would be mediatorial processes, whether it's the evolutionary shaping of our moral emotions and moral reactions. That's okay.
Yeah.
They're mediated, but they're not created.
Yeah.
By evolution or by social shaping. That's the kind of embodied world we live in, where we've got all these material mechanisms that help shape us and mediate what's higher.
Yeah.
And Lewis was huge on the lower, mediating what's higher.
Yeah, I love that. I've seen a little bit of that work in moral philosophy with Thomas Nagel citing like Sharon Street, a Darwinian dilemma for
Moral realist.
yeah, moral, and it's like
Yeah.
it's like a moral argument version of Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, and it's so fantastic. She's actually arguing you should not be a moral realist if you hold naturalistic evolutionary theory.
Absolutely. I don't know if you've seen the Cambridge Handbook of Evolutionary Ethics, came out a few years ago, just a few years ago. And I have the last entry, the last chapter in that.
Okay.
And the Sharon Streets and the Richard Joyce types are in the early part, their arguments. Russ Schaefer Landau is in there. Bill Kirk Fitzpatrick from Rochester is in there. But I get the last word, interestingly enough, and it's I call the chapter a theological evaluation of evolutionary ethics. Try to avoid dichotomies.
Yeah.
You can make better sense of evolutionary ethics to the extent that evolution helps shape our moral emotions on theism than on naturalism.
Yeah. Wow. I love that. Oh, that's fantastic. Okay. So, most of our listeners will be familiar with the trilemma. Either, Jesus was a liar, lunatic, or Lord. Something that I really appreciate about your work that I didn't know before reading yours was that, well, I knew like Christopher Hitchens would say,
Oh, yeah.
C.S. Lewis didn't know how to make a syllogism, the poor man, and just bashing
yeah.
Lewis.
Yeah.
But you brought up a Christian philosopher, Howard Snyder, who said that there's also so these three are not jointly exhaustive because there's another one. Jesus could have been merely mistaken.
Sure.
And I wanted to get your thoughts on. To me, it's like I know Peter Kreeft, I think, says there's no way that someone could be merely mistaken that they were God or not. That would be the lunatic option. So those two go together. What are your thoughts on that?
I want to go back and frame up the point of the argument in a minute, but I'm with Kreeft on that one.
Okay.
And also, there's another reply out there to Dan Howard Snyder, and I can't remember the reply, who also is with Kreeft and me.
Okay.
That's kind of a stretch.
Yeah.
To be merely mistaken. But if you think about this, Lewis is not the simpleton that a lot of people make him out to be in thinking this little 2 or 3 sentence argument in Mere Christianity, which is a series of popular radio broadcasts,
right?
That was the totality of the argument. Lewis is well aware of the things said about the nature of Jesus of the Gospels. He's aware of the quest for the historical Jesus. Albert Schweitzer's book, The Quest for the Historical Jesus. In our day, we have the Jesus Seminar.
Yeah.
But in many ways, these are sort of naturalist motivated interpretations that cannot acknowledge the supernatural aspect of Jesus. So very often, the kindest thing you can hear said by naturalist interpreters is Jesus was a great moral teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And so as he's unfolding the nature of Jesus in Mere Christianity over this series of radio broadcasts that have been all assembled in Mere Christianity, the book, he's saying that's one option, that he's a good moral teacher. I have to take off the table.
Right.
That makes no sense at all. Take it off the table. And then a good moral teacher would never say the things he did and be lying and all that, or be psychotic. If that's off the table, then you're left with the trilemma.
Mm-hmm.
So there was already an option. And so what you do in reasoning by the rule of disjunctive syllogism,
mm-hmm.
you eliminate the options till you find the one that's your conclusion. So you've got those 3 options. And in many ways, it's about assigning probabilities to the options. And he thought that the other options have very low probability.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
No problem.
And so he's getting to the option, well, then it's most likely he's Lord.
Yeah.
And so it's a process of elimination. There are clearly other options, maybe two or three others. So it doesn't have to be a trilemma. It could be a quadrilemma. It could be a hexalemma.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
a lemma just means a line of reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
So you choose lines. If he's a lunatic, you go down this line of reasoning. If he's a good moral teacher, you go down this line. And Lewis is just very briefly assessing those probabilities.
Yeah.
And coming up with the problem. We've got to say he's Lord. The others may just make no sense to Lewis.
Yeah. So
that's a big debate. But in many ways, it goes to the Bultmannian shadow that hangs over all of modern theology, that the Jesus of the Gospels just cannot be the Jesus of history.
Right.
Because the Jesus of the Gospels has a supernatural aspect.
Yeah, and we can turn on our light switch nowadays. We flip, so we can't believe in the supernatural. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So moving on to the doctrine of the Trinity, and this again is so encouraging to me because for so long, and you know, I already admitted that I'm kind of coming from this presuppositionalist camp. For so long, people have argued for bare theism. I'm happy to move you along to bare theism and you know, just believe in God. That's better than not believing in God. And so I pulled a quote from you from this book. Lewis saw the doctrine of the Trinity as the largest possible framework for the Christian vision of reality, the most fundamental conceptual component in the Christian worldview. And that's so encouraging to me because Lewis is saying the Trinity is at the foundational level of our worldview. It's not just bare theism. And the amazing thing to think about with Lewis is in his broadcast talks, he's broadcasting about the Trinity. And I don't know how many of us would feel very comfortable in like a short little broadcast talk going over the doctrine of the Trinity, but he felt like it was so important that he needs to do that.
That's a very good point. I mean, really, the doctrine of creation plays off the doctrine of the Trinity, that God, who is at the heart of reality, a self-living, self-giving life, chose to freely create a finite world and invite that world back into himself, back into fellowship with himself. The doctrine of the incarnation plays off of the Trinity, that it's God the Son, the second person, who became incarnate in a first century person, Jesus of Nazareth, and thereby bonded to our humanity forever, to show us how close to humanity he wants to be. So, in my view, the doctrine of the Trinity is the central organizing doctrine.
Yes,
and is amazing. In fact, the fourth book of Mere Christianity is entitled Beyond Personality.
Yeah.
Beyond Personality. First Steps in Doctrine of the Trinity. And to be really honest, when I look at Lewis commentators and interpreters and people who want to do their apologetics by partly referring to Lewis, I never see it referred to.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that this is an amazing blind spot to me. That we're not mining the riches of the doctrine of the Trinity for proposing the kind of world in which everything about us makes best sense.
Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right there. And I think that it's so often, the doctrine of the Trinity is so often seen as something we'll get to later. Once you bridge the gap, once you come over to theism, then we can finally get to Trinity, where you're already in, so you have to accept it. Whereas Lewis is putting it the foundational level and saying this is an explanation for the personality that we find in the world. That me right now, I'm a person, and I've been made. And so in that sense, I really see Lewis as a personalist, even though that may be anachronistic to point back to him. I don't know. Personalism might have been at the same time as Lewis, but he grounds foundational reality in persons, the personal.
That's right.
Personal God.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, personalism, like the Boston School was a form of divine finitism and all
Yeah.
that. No reason to go back to that mistake.
Okay.
But that's right. I mean, if you say, well, I'm going to take a more linear approach, unfolding to bare theism, if you accept bare theism and then Christianity, then you'll accept the Trinity largely on dogmatic grounds.
Yeah.
Okay. But what Lewis is saying is he's willing to argue in linear fashion about lots of topics, but I think so. There's the reason side, the rational side. I think we have to also appreciate that his approach was more comprehensive and holistic.
Yeah.
On the imaginative side,
Yep.
suspend your disbelief. Let's don't argue for now. Just consider what is entailed by these different worldviews and imagine what reality would be like if they are in fact true, and then compare that and suspend judgment for now.
Mm-hmm.
But like in his fantasy and his fiction, you really do get a kind of sense of that.
Yeah.
And so the Trinitarian universe of orthodoxy explains so much.
Yeah.
And it's rich and it's fulfilling. And surely we would say we deeply want it. Our reason might say it's false. It's improbable. I can't accept it right now rationally. But my goodness, wouldn't it be wonderful if it were true?
Yeah. Yeah, I really like that. I like the way you explain that, because it's suspend your disbelief. Come over and put on these goggles. Come over and drive this car. See how it rides, and then let's go and look at yours. I'm gonna poke some holes in yours, and we'll see which one best explains reality. With Lewis, I love Lewis talks about different levels of reality, like a two-dimensional flatlander trying to think about a three-dimensional person. Super duper helpful. Again, it's an analogy. He's not saying God is like that, but you broach this topic a little bit, maybe more so than I'm thinking. But can we analyze Lewis's doctrine of the Trinity along the modern social and anti-social Trinitarian lines, or does he not neatly fit into those categories?
You know, I probably don't have anything really well thought out to say about that.
Yeah.
But he's clearly a social Trinitarian of some variety.
Yeah.
And I just don't see how you could not be, in an Orthodox vein, a social Trinitarian. And I do think that some of the anti-social Trinitarian, perceptions are that it gives up some control of a sovereign God. Sovereignty looks different to the anti-social Trinitarian, and some things like that.
Yeah.
And I don't read a lot in that area, but that's my impression, that there's some implicit instinct for more of a top-down, power-down model.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. I think something that's interesting that you did broach was the concept of the great dance and perichoresis.
Yep.
And I think for anyone listening that is an anti-social Trinitarian, which, I'm not super comfortable with social Trinitarianism, because it seems like it's bordering on tritheism, right? But Lewis is bringing it back with
that's a debate.
Yeah, right, and that's the debate. And Lewis is bringing it back with this doctrine of perichoresis, the great dance. And again, I want to put him in conversation with Van Til, who also did that and also brought in the doctrine of perichoresis, and why that's so important for saying that God is he's a person and he's three persons, right? And you don't say that in the same way that it's contradictory.
Yep.
But yeah, I thought that was so interesting. Any thoughts on the great dance? Is that fresh in your mind enough to talk about?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I too am fascinated by, these are meditations by St. Gregory of Nazianzus, on John chapters 14 through 17 in the Gospel of John. The passages that refer to, if Jesus would say, if I abide in the Father, if the Father abides in me, if you abide in me, and if I abide in you, all the mutual abiding, the mutual indwelling, depending on the translation, suggests, in my view, a perichoretic relational universe That is part of the very texture of reality that God has created. In fact, it's part of the very texture of the reality that God is.
Yeah.
There are perichoretic relations in the Trinity.
Mm-hmm.
The love exchange of giving and receiving has been going on in the life of God forever.
Amen.
Creation then is not to get something like the pagan gods, to get worship or servants or whatever. It's to give. It's to give the gift of finite, rational, moral, spiritual life to creatures and invite them back into that divine life. As Lewis says, we have to find our place in that dance,
Yeah.
in that great love exchange, both in loving God and loving others. And that's the deepest truth of our finite created reality.
Yeah. I love that. And it really, it's bordering on Swinburne's argument for the Trinity from love, which he got from Hugh of St. Victor or something. And it's the same thing, where if God is a person and if he's tri-personal, then he's able to love and he's able to create out of love, and we're able to love, and he doesn't need us. He didn't create us in order to love. He didn't change his essential being in order to do that. And I love that. I think you handle that well in the book. So another thing to recommend. I wanted to end on good and evil, and I was going to go a different direction, but as I was finishing up the book, I saw your treatment of Jadis. Is that right? Am I saying that right? Jadis?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so.
Yeah. So Jadis and Lewis held, I think he holds to, at least he does in his books, about a privationist view of evil, that evil is not a thing in and of itself. It's a corruption of a good.
Yeah.
Is that fair, you think? Is it fair to say that he was a privationist in that sense?
Oh, I think very much, because if you think creational metaphysics, Christian metaphysics, God creates being.
Mm-hmm.
He creates beings with different natures, but he creates no junk. He creates no evil. There's no resistance to his creative will and power. So he creates what he wants. He may do it through secondary causes like a material creation run by laws, including evolutionary laws, but he still gets his results. So we have a nature that's deeply good. Even the entrance of sin, theologically speaking, doesn't change the metaphysical, deeper truth of our enduring created goodness.
Yeah.
The kind of thing we are is good and meant for life with God.
Yeah.
That's what tell us. But there's infection. Lewis uses that term.
Mm-hmm.
There's a warping, a damage. He uses some terms like warping, I think for sure he uses, like in maybe Great Divorce. Their personalities become warped. But these are alien to our created nature, and without them, we're more fully human.
Yeah.
So we're not truly ourselves in Louisian language until we're more fully redeemed and healed, but definitely a privationist. So something's either warped or damaged, an underlying good thing.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. And that again goes back to Augustine and that privation view, and what you already talked about earlier, that our hearts are restless until they find their sourcing in God. And I found that similar theme in Herman Bavinck, who talks about a active privationist account of evil. And so all these folks influenced by Augustine is so fantastic. And so you can find Augustine in Lewis. If you read Miracles, you're going to see a lot of Augustine. If you read Mere Christianity, you're going to see a lot of Aristotle and Aquinas. And he's deeply grounded in the historical faith, the Orthodox faith, from the Church Fathers to the Bible. It's not just a surface level thing. And you think about all the hard work that had to go from funneling all these people down into a popular level book, which was popular level back then and now is a little bit more advanced because our education system is failing us. But going back to Jadis, you were talking about the creation account in The Magician's Nephew, right? Is that's
yeah.
And I was instantly thinking of Melkor in Tolkien's. He's singing a twisted melody, and then the next sentence you bring up Tolkien and Melkor, and I thought, yes, I'm thinking along the right line. Can you recount the the Jadis evil for us?
Yeah, I don't have that in front of me in great detail, but the idea, I think we have to say in Lewis, is that there was the intent to spoil an originally good creation. So the entrance of sin and evil in the world is viewed as, once again, the privation, the lack, the of good, or I really think it probably communicates at least as well to say the damage or the warping
Yeah.
of the good.
Yeah. That's so helpful. Yeah. So the devil isn't creating things, he's warping good things that God created. God can create.
Well, if you think about it, in fact, the concept of a Satan figure is of a very good kind of created finite being, rational, moral, social powers, non-embodied. We are rational, moral, social beings, those same kinds of powers. We happen to be essentially, not contingently, but essentially embodied beings.
Yeah.
But those are very good kind. So Satan's just a creature.
Yeah.
And so, and he's experienced damage. And we've experienced damage, if you think about it. But there's no power that rivals God or something that eternally is evil.
Yeah.
Not in a theistic, monotheistic universe.
Yeah.
Evil is always something gone wrong.
Yeah.
That's under, yeah.
Well, and I think Lewis, piggybacking on Augustine, is he can use that to argue against this kind of dualism of, ultimate good and ultimate evil, eternally in battle. No, it doesn't work because good is or evil is parasitic on good.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So finishing up, so you recount Lewis's free will defense against evil, and Lewis takes a couple different stable environment defense, and it's really interesting the different lines that he takes. And so Lewis, the proponent of libertarian free will, of the leeway freedom principle of alternate possibilities, very much a libertarian free will proponent here. And
I think
yeah, totally. And you recount that well in your book. And I think Plantinga has done a really good job of just picking up a lot of Lewis's arguments and then just in just arduous syllogistic fashion, drawing them out and drawing out their implications for philosophers. But an interesting thing, and maybe you won't care as much about this, but I consider myself like a Paralandrian compatibilist, because there's this great line in Paralandra where he's talking about Weston is going to be confronted by Ransom, and Ransom is like, it's already happened. I can see that it's already happened. And then at this one moment, I can see that predestination and free will are one, that I'm doing this freely, but it's already as if it's done. And I love this. I read this passage all the time because it kind of affirmed it. So it's a weird place to find compatibilism from Lewis, the arch libertarian defense arguer. So I just thought that was an interesting, find different spots in him.
some people point also to the ending of the Great Divorce.
Yeah.
The chess figures, the chess game and the giant figures are playing chess as getting in the same territory. I don't see it as a compatibilist move on Lewis's part. I think Lewis is partly, he believes that his view of divine timelessness, which he gets from Augustine, Boethius, Anselm, he thinks that can preserve libertarian free will. As I understand Lewis, he never really makes that argument in an explicit way, a direct way.
Yeah.
But I think he believes that'll work. I'm not convinced it will work. I'm not a timelessness person.
I think you mentioned that in the end of your book, right? This is one place where you think that we should probably not follow Lewis.
Well, it goes to, there had to be some kind of an intersection. There had to be, in the fullness of time, an intersection of Greek thought, concepts, concerns philosophically with Christian thought, Christian belief. The seven great councils needed Christian categories, needed Greek categories to formulate Christian doctrines. They needed Greek logic, etc. The question is, how much Greek philosophy, when does it become just baggage? Actually could distort. And timelessness certainly has a Greek heritage.
Mm-hmm.
And so that element, in my view, is worth discussing more fully.
Yeah.
Maybe being, because I'm not prepared to do it. None of us are prepared to do it right here.
Yeah.
Right now, as being probably some of the baggage. Now, in Mere Christianity, when Lewis is talking about the life of the Trinity, he has a chapter on timelessness, and he starts right out by saying this is not essential to orthodoxy. If you have a different opinion, you can read the chapter if you want to, or you can just move on. But he's at least officially committing to timelessness.
Yeah.
If you read his robust accounts of free will, you wonder how free will and timelessness can really go together. But free will is critical in a way that timelessness is not to the vision of a relational universe. If it's truly a relational universe where God takes relational risks in creating libertarian free creatures, that's the deeper value than timelessness. I think there's a tension that under discussion we could work out between timelessness and libertarian free will, and that libertarian free will has to be preserved.
Yeah.
Timelessness, and I'm not so sure.
Yeah, type of triage going on there. Yeah, and I think also I'm pretty sure you brought this up, but the Great Dance and perichoresis might also be at odds with the timelessness block universe kind of aspect. Which, if that's the case, then Lewis said the Trinity is deeper, more foundational than block universe. So if that's the case and they do conflict, then drop the block universe timelessness view.
And the dominoes continue to fall. I mean, then all of a sudden you've got. I think I mentioned this also, maybe in the incarnation chapter, that the incarnation, God acts in history.
Yeah.
So those things also readily look like they're in tension with timelessness.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. And this is like the weakest area for me, where I'm not well versed on time, so we'll have to pick this up at a different time. But Dr. Peterson, thanks so much for your time. I wonder if I could ask if I could put to bed one last misconception about Lewis, which I thought you did a great job on. Universalism in the Last Battle.
Oh, yeah.
People the Last Battle, Lewis was a universalist. And I think even in one of the prefaces, maybe someone wrote a preface to The Great Divorce. And I think it was this lady, and she said, finally, Lewis's universalism is put on full display. And I was like, what the heck is going on with this? Can you speak to
the lack of making finer distinctions?
Yeah.
So finer distinctions, sharper categories need to be applied. Clearly, if we use the sort of standard categories these days of exclusivism and pluralism, Lewis is neither one. And then universalism, I think he's not a universalist either. Right. But exclusivist is basically going to say that there's no salvation apart from explicit belief in Christ. But then we have the idea that this is a good God, a fair and just and loving God. And you think, well, then the religious luck or bad luck of people throughout history and around the globe is that nobody has had an equal chance to hear the gospel and to explicitly accept Christ.
Yeah.
Countless millions have lived and died without ever hearing the gospel, or may I say, a credible presentation of the gospel. That's why I have to block certain religious channels on my cable so that my grandkids can't see some of those presentations.
Yeah, yeah.
They're too tender. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so even a credible exclusivism suggests that God is willing to hold people accountable for something not within their power, to make somebody come and preach the gospel in a credible way to them. And it's not within their power. So a lot of people, because that's so unlovely and suggests an unjust God, they become pluralists. They think, well, there must be just one supernatural being, divine realm, and all religions are sort of different ways.
Yeah, he's the real or the elephant. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a Hindu poem, actually. About Brahman.
Yeah.
Brahman, it's a non-evangelistic religion. And so it's inherently doctrinally it's pluralistic.
Yeah.
So at any rate, Lewis is neither of those. And he's recognizing if God is truly just and truly merciful and loving, then exclusivism certainly cannot be true. And what do you do with the great variability among the experiences of people on how the exposure they have to the gospel?
Yeah.
So here's this episode where Emmett, the warrior that has served Tash all his life with great fidelity and earnestness, and Aslan says to him, I see your heart. Effectively, he's saying, I see your heart. You were seeking the good. You were mistaken about who embodied the good. But I'm going to, in my infinite wisdom, I'm translating here, I'm going to accept all of that as service done to me. Not that he's preaching a salvation by works, but he's preventing this from being an unjust universe.
Yeah.
In which Emmett didn't have a chance for clarification until he met Aslan.
Yeah.
And you multiply that over many cases. But then you get the universalism I don't see how the universalism could be attributed to Lewis. Universalism is something God does. He's going to make sure everybody's going to be saved.
Yeah.
And what Lewis is saying many times throughout a lot of his writings, Great Divorce, other places as well, it's up to us what happens to us. And so if we're all saved, we're all saved. But or if somebody wants to go to hell, the door to hell is, what was he say?
Locked from the inside?
Locked on the inside,
Yeah.
kind of thing. So the creatures lock themselves up
Right.
in their own hell. And so God gives them the intolerable compliment of letting them have their free will.
Yeah.
So it's just hard for me to see that Lewis, naturally we would hope that everyone would be saved, and in the eschatological future, the divine mercy and grace would pursue them and somehow bring them all in. But you never know, because there's so much up to the creature.
Yeah. Yeah. So even Lewis's strong affirmation of libertarian free will would preclude him from being a universalist. If he believed in election, then perhaps God could elect all persons, but he's not. And so even in the book, not all there's bad Narnians, or one of the princesses of Narnia, she doesn't follow him. She's not a friend of Narnia anymore. I forgot, Jill or one of the girls. Susan, yeah. And she's not a friend of Narnia anymore. So she's hope for her as long as she's still alive. But certainly he's not a universalist, though. Some people may take issue that he's not an exclusivist. Work that out yourself. You're going to answer that differently based on your own theological pre-commitments. But he's not a universalist. So we need to put that myth to bed. Yeah.
Use your own theological pre-commitments, but be fair to the actual Lewis text.
Amen. Totally. That's right. Absolutely. Well, Dr. Peterson, again, thank you so much. Thank you for this book, C.S. Lewis and the Christian Worldview. I recommend everyone go grab that copy right now. There's a lot that we didn't talk about. We did cover a ton, but there's so much that we didn't, that Dr. Peterson draws out of Lewis, this great philosopher, Christian poet, child story author. It's awesome. And I really appreciated your emphasis on the Christian worldview. That was really helpful for me.
Well, you're certainly welcome. And I might add one recommendation to your listeners.
Yeah, please.
Don't just buy a single copy, buy a case.
There you go.
And give it out at all special gifting occasions, weddings, birthdays, bar mitzvahs.
Yeah.
Help your friends. It's a relational universe.
That's
it's a
right.
Universe.
That's awesome. Awesome. Well, thanks. So this has been Parker's Pensies. As always, all glory